Tim Hickerson was denied bond today in the 2010 homicide of Shane Donahue. Let's talk about it. Tim appeared in district court today in Prince William County in front of Judge Terkessa Rollins. His family was there to support him, and Shane's family was there as well. Tim's lawyer, Mr. Sloan, got up and argued why his client should be granted bond. The first thing that he hit on was the issue of fighting extradition. We've talked about this before if you watched the previous videos in this playlist or listened to our podcast update episode on this. It appeared as though Tim was fighting extradition and did not want to come back to Virginia. From what I had been hearing, that wasn't the case. It was just like a clerical error, and that is what his lawyer contended today. He said that there was an issue with the attorney down there and that Tim did not want to fight extradition. He wanted to come back up here and face these charges as soon as possible. Now, another thing that happens in Prince William County is they take a test to see how good of a candidate they will be for bonds. And his lawyer said that based on his results, he has an 88% chance that he's likely to appear for, any other hearings. A 72% chance that he will remain arrest-free if let out on bond, and a 95% chance that he would remain violent felony-free if let out on bond, which are high numbers. So there are a couple other bond hearings prior to Tim's getting called, and he had the highest numbers, like the best numbers of anybody else. But the judge had denied bond in every single case that we saw this morning prior to Tim's, and they were all on much lesser charges than, homicide and burglary. Tim's lawyer did admit that he had been arrested in 2010 for robbing a gun store and that he did serve 4 years in federal prison. However, since being released in 2014, he had basically, just been living his life. He had never had any issues with parole, never had any other criminal charges levied against him until this. He had just been living a pretty quiet life. So he's saying he's not a flight risk, and he's also not a risk to the community. He said that there was no firearm involved in this, at least from what we know from the prosecution. He brought up that, Shane's missing, so we don't actually know how he was killed. He also pointed out in terms of the flight risk aspect that the Hickerson family are longtime residents of Nokesville and that they still live there. In fact, his parents and sister were in the courtroom. They said that prior to his incarceration in 2010, Tim grew up and lived in Nokesville and still has strong family ties. So the plan, if he was granted bond, was that he would go live with his parents and get a job working with his brother doing electrical work. I've been kind of wondering, just curious, what Tim has been up to since he was released from prison. And his lawyer did say that he's been working in electric, flooring and tile, construction work, stuff like that. And that his current job prior to getting arrested was as an operations manager for a flooring company. They also said that he had no probation violations and no drug issues, because that is something that both sides freely admit, that Tim was using drugs in 2010 when all of this was happening. So his lawyer said that there's also no indication that he would intimidate witnesses or anything like that. And they did talk about something that's interesting that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think of when we look at cases like this. He was saying that regardless of the outcome, meaning whether or not Tim is found guilty or innocent of these charges, he's financially ruined. Not only does he have all these attorney fees that he now has to pay, but if he's not allowed out on bond, he can't work. And his lawyer was talking about how his wife will probably have to sell the house because she can't afford it on just her income. These cases have long-reaching financial implications, even if you're innocent. But of course, we don't know what's going on here yet. The prosecution got up and said why they are objecting to bond. She started out by talking about the basic facts of the case, which we've gone over in previous videos and on the podcast, that on the last day that he was seen, Tim and Shane went over to Shane's parents' house and left together. 20 to 30 minutes later, Shane's phones went off the network and never came back on. Now, the story that Tim gave was that he was driving Shane home because Shane wasn't driving at the time. His license had been suspended. But when Shane's phones went off the network, they were not near his home. They were in the vicinity of the Hickerson family farm. Now that farm has been sold, but the Hickersons still live nearby. Then she also talked about the gun store burglary. And said, and this is something really, really interesting that I had not heard before. She said that when the detectives were questioning him about the burglary of the gun store, they asked him about Shane. And, Tim gave his story, like, I just dropped him off at home, don't know what happened after that. And the detective asked Tim, is Shane's body buried at your parents' property? And Tim replied, no, it shouldn't be. And when the detective asked what he meant by that, he said, you guys already did the search. So I don't know how to take that, but I do think it's interesting that they did question him about Shane. But more importantly, during that interview, Tim admitted to burglarizing Shane's home a few days prior to his disappearance. And that is one of the charges that he's here facing. It's homicide and burglary. And the burglary is of Shane's home. According to the prosecution, Tim told detectives that he broke into Shane's home to steal pills and he got high with his friend Craig. He also said that he owed Shane around $500 for drugs. Now, we don't know the veracity of this confession, and the defense said it was flimsy, but that could be huge. The prosecution also brought up a really good point that Tim and Shane were in constant communication. In the 4 days leading up to Shane's disappearance, there were 73 phone calls between the two, but 0 after Shane was last seen. And she said that's because Tim knew there was no reason to call him because he knew exactly where he was. She also said that they re-interviewed one of Tim's friends. And in April, so Shane was last seen on March 22nd, 2010. In April, when Tim found out that the property at his parents' house would be searched, he called his friend in a panic and said that he needed to find Shane's gun that Tim had taken and buried on the property. So we'll have to see what the actual evidence of that is. The defense said that they hadn't seen any of this, so they can't say how true any of it is, and neither can we. So at the end of the day, which I thought was interesting, the judge denied bond not because she thought he was a danger to society, but because she thought he was a flight risk. And I personally, the defense was saying they could do GPS monitoring, house arrest, blah, blah, blah. Like, the idea of him being a flight risk as the reason to deny him bond just doesn't make as much sense as saying it's second-degree murder. So I don't know, but either way, he is remaining in jail. I'll bring you updates and let me know if you have any questions. Also, I do have a playlist of other videos on this, and we do have a new podcast episode that just came out a few weeks ago, running it all down.